The town on the coast was outdated, with gray buildings that seemed gloomy even on the sunniest days. It felt as though this corner of the earth had been forgotten by time itself. The paths leading to the old beaches were covered in a thick layer of sand and grass, which no one tended to anymore. Everyone here knew each other, and even the little road that led to the settlement was surrounded by dozens of old legends. But there was one that was only mentioned on the darkest, scariest nights, about the Black Shore. Since childhood, I had heard stories about this place. People who vanished without a trace, strange flashes of light in the sky, and even abandoned ships that remained on the shore as if waiting for something. No one dared to approach the Black Shore after sunset. It was forbidden territory, and even the old locals never discussed it as an ordinary piece of land. But we, the teenagers, didn't believe in these spooky tales. We thought all of it was invented by people who lived in fear. We lacked that element of horror in our lives because we wanted new sensations, new adventures. So one evening, as soon as the sun began to set behind the horizon, we set off there. No one stopped us, even as the fog started to descend and the wind from the sea grew colder than usual. In our company were me, Jake, the one who always doubted but still followed the others, our leader Mark, stubborn and determined, Sarah, who was more cautious and always looked at us with suspicion, Tom, the one who always laughed at our ideas, but sometimes even took part in the most foolish things. We all dreamed of something big, and we thought that by going to the Black Shore, we would see something we had never seen before. "Doesn't this place seem strange to you?" Sarah asked, already feeling the air grow colder. "Maybe it does," I replied. "But it's just legends. We need to check it out. There's nothing scary about it." Mark led us through the thick forest, and soon we reached the shore. The sand here was black, like coal, and the sea water had a deep, almost black color. It wasn't moving, and everything around us felt unreal, as if we had entered another world. The forest surrounding the beach looked even more gloomy. The trees resembled ancient pillars, staring at us with their dark branches, like arms ready to pull us into the depths. There were no bird sounds, no rustling of the wind, just a dead silence. "This looks unnatural," Sarah whispered, standing at the water's edge. Mark clenched his fists and, sneering, replied, "It's just a place, nothing more. We can do this. Let's light a fire, and it will just be another adventure." And we did. We lit a fire, and soon the darkness began to feel thicker, and the flames only intensified the feeling that something was approaching. The shadows of the trees grew larger, and the wind from the sea became warm but unpleasantly heavy. The fire and its weak light couldn't illuminate more than a few meters around us. And then we heard it, a sound that started to echo from the darkness. Barely audible at first, but gradually it became clearer. At first, we thought it was just the wind, but with each passing minute, it grew louder and began to take form. "Who's that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Mark fell silent, clenching his fists. He stared into the darkness, his face distorted with a feeling of something dangerous that he couldn't explain. We saw it. A shadow moving in the sea. It was enormous, like a giant creature swimming up from the depths. We held our breath. "What was it?" "It's just a fish," Mark said, but his voice sounded hollow. But I knew it wasn't just a fish. Something about this shadow wasn't natural. It moved too quickly, and its outline was blurry, unclear. We couldn't figure out what it was, but one thing was certain: it was something more than we could have imagined. "We need to leave," I said, feeling the hair on the back of my neck rise. "This isn't the mysterious place we thought it was. It's danger." Mark scowled, but his face also changed its expression. "Why?" "It's just a hoax. Let's continue." But the longer we stood, the more the surrounding forest seemed alive, as though it was watching us. I could feel my legs trembling, and fear filled my heart. Meanwhile, we began to notice that the way back to the forest was becoming more and more difficult. With each step, it seemed that the path was changing, and it was no longer possible to tell which way to go. We were trapped. We began to head back, but with each step, the forest seemed more relentless. The shadows of the trees, which had once been mere dark silhouettes on the horizon, now looked like huge, twisted hands pulling us into the darkness. The wind started to whistle through the trees, but the sound was muffled, barely audible, as if it didn't belong to this world. The grass under our feet began to rise, growing too quickly, and it seemed that each step we took didn't bring us any closer to the exit. "We're lost," Tom said, his voice heavy with panic. "This forest doesn't feel normal." I began to feel my heart pounding in my chest, and it became harder to breathe. I turned back, looking at Mark, but his face was no longer as confident as before. He didn't answer my question, and that only intensified the growing anxiety inside me. "What's wrong with you?" I asked him, trying to see his face in the dark. Mark didn't answer. He just clenched his fists and stared into the depth of the forest, as if waiting for something. His gaze was empty, and there was a coldness in it that wasn't typical of his usual demeanor. His coldness was terrifying. "This isn't just a forest," he finally said, and his voice was hollow. "This place, it's doing something to us." I felt my legs grow heavier. It seemed like I couldn't move, as if the ground beneath me was trying to pull me in. Sarah, who had been silent the whole time, suddenly screamed. "What is that?" She pointed at an unknown object standing in front of us. In the darkness, we saw something incomprehensible. It looked like a huge stone, but its shape was wrong. It resembled a giant sculpture, carved from dark stone. However, in how it was positioned and in its distorted forms, there was something horrifying. We approached it, and the closer we got, the more we felt that something was wrong. It seemed like the stone itself was absorbing the light, and even our breathing became heavier. "This isn't just a stone," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. This is something old, something that shouldn't be here." We all stood silently because none of us dared to take another step. "We need to leave," I said quietly. But my words had no power. Fear paralyzed each one of us. We felt how the darkness around us grew even thicker, and every step felt heavier, as if the earth itself was trying to stop us. Suddenly, something hissed deep in the forest. It was a sound like a guttural laugh, echoing from a distance, but it was still clear that it was coming towards us. "Who's that?" Sarah asked, her voice sounding like a frightened sigh. I looked around and saw Mark flinch. He raised his hand, pointing at something that had appeared from the darkness. It wasn't a person, nor an animal. It was something else, not from this world. It looked like a centipede, but not an ordinary one. It moved so fast that its shapes blended into one terrifying shadow. It was crawling towards us, and with every movement, we felt the ground beneath us tremble. "Run!" I shouted. We started running, not knowing where exactly, just as far away as possible from this horrifying creature. The forest around us began to change again, and every step felt even more difficult. The steps grew heavier, and every movement seemed burdened with something dark and invisible. We ran without purpose, unable to find the way back. I looked around, but the forest seemed to close everything off. There was no sky, no sun, no starlight, only impenetrable darkness. And every time we tried to turn in what seemed like the right direction, the forest shifted, keeping us in place. "This is impossible," Sarah whispered. "What is this place doing to us?" We didn't know how to answer. Each of us was in panic, but we couldn't stop. Time had become distorted. The forest stretched on, and the clock had stopped keeping time. Then, once again, that same voice echoed. "You shouldn't be here. This place is not for you." We froze. The voice came from all sides, like a bell that penetrated straight into our minds. It was faint, but its meaning was clear. We were trapped. "This isn't a place, it's a living being," Mark said, his voice so chilling that I couldn't believe what I was hearing. We began to look around and saw how a tree we had passed just minutes ago now looked different. It was larger, with bark peeling off, resembling a face watching us. And everything around us was the same. The forest wasn't just trees, it was alive. "What is this place?" Sarah asked, her face showing pure terror. "This isn't a forest," Mark replied. It's a trap. And we are part of that trap. Meanwhile, we heard something behind us. It was one of the same dark shadows that had been following us, but now we were surrounded by them. All our attempts to find an exit led us only deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, I realized there was no way out. We were already part of this dark land, and our names had already become part of new legends that would terrify future generations. And when that became clear, I felt the silence engulfing me. The silence was so heavy that every breath I took seemed as loud as an explosion. We stood frozen, unable to move, and even the whisper of the wind no longer brought any sense of relief. I looked at Mark, and I saw the same fear on his face that I felt. He realized that everything happening was not just a terrifying coincidence. This was a plan, orchestrated by the forest, or rather, by Black Shore itself. Now, this place had become its home, and we were just a small part of this enormous, dark machine. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking, her eyes filled with utter despair. We had no answer. The forest was shifting around us. Every step we took only deepened the pull into the darkness. I couldn't turn my head back, because it felt like if I did, I would simply disappear into the abyss waiting behind us. Again, the shadow sounded. It was slow, but unstoppable. It was catching up to us. I could hear its steps, quiet and ominous, like the very shadow that had become part of the forest. "Run!" I whispered. But there was nowhere to run. We ran, but our legs grew heavy, and the strength drained from us. The forest wrapped around us more tightly with its black branches. The trees seemed like cruel giants, pulling their roots from the earth, creating walls around us. In every tree, there were eyes, large, black, merciless. They stared at us, and it felt as though they were simply waiting for the moment to swallow us whole. "This isn't just a place," Mark repeated. It's something that has become alive." We ran, but now each of our steps felt like the steps of the dead. We were trapped in a snare where every movement only brought more pain and fear. The forest was so dark that we couldn't distinguish its boundaries. It felt like I was losing consciousness again. I didn't know how much time had passed before we saw it. It was the sky, but it wasn't the sky we were used to seeing. It was black, with red spots stretching across the horizon. It was a sky we weren't supposed to see. And at that moment we heard it. The voice. Again. "You still won't be able to escape. This place takes everything. Your souls, your dreams. You will become part of this forest, just like everyone who has come here before you." We froze. I felt my legs no longer obeying me. They no longer obeyed because we had become part of this place. We moved, but we were no longer ourselves. We had become puppets in the hands of this dreadful, relentless forest. Time ceased to exist. I didn't know how long we had been wandering through this darkness, how many hours or days had passed. The forest gave us no sense of time. It was beyond time, just like our souls. In the darkness, we began to feel that the forest was watching us. It saw every movement we made, every thought we had. We became part of it, and now it watched us like a predator waiting for the moment to destroy us. We stopped near a massive tree. It was black, blending into the night's darkness, and looked as if it were part of the forest itself. The trees around it reached their branches toward it, creating a shadow that concealed everything we could see. But the scariest thing was that we began to hear voices. They weren't clear, but I could make out some words. "You shouldn't be here." These words echoed in my head, and I couldn't tell if it was reality or just my imagination. But when I turned my head, I saw that we were not alone. They were all here. The people who had once wandered the forest had become part of it. Their faces were distorted, their eyes black and empty. They weren't alive, but they weren't dead either. They were shadows that had no past or future. "Now you are part of us too," said one of them. His voice was terribly muffled and cold. I couldn't say what it was, but I felt that we couldn't escape our fate. This place took everything, not just bodies, but souls too. "Your soul is part of this forest," said another voice. I felt my legs grow heavy, and I started to feel that my body no longer obeyed my will. We were all already part of this place, this terrible trap. We became helpless, powerless. The forest consumed us, and we knew that we would never leave it alive. Time stopped. The forest was no longer just a place, it became our eternal home. We were part of it, and now every movement we made was just another step toward being consumed. We remained here, with no way to turn back. I don't know how much time passed. Days and nights blended into one endless darkness. We no longer thought of salvation, for it was impossible. We had become part of the forest, part of the black shore, and each new breath was only a whisper from this dark being that surrounded us. And now we are just a legend, part of this forest. The forest was not just a forest. We began to realize this when we once again stumbled upon one of its greatest secrets. After we had become powerless before its magic, and as the evening quickly turned into relentless darkness, we noticed something we hadn't seen before. In the darkness, faint lines began to appear under our feet, leading downward. Perhaps it was an ancient road, or tunnels hidden beneath the black shore. I became intrigued, although I felt that this decision could be fatal. Yet I couldn't stop. One by one, we began to descend, and when we found ourselves in the underground chamber, we realized that the forest was not just alive, it breathed, it had its own history. Above us was a stone ceiling, and around us, cold stone walls covered with red lichen that glowed in the dark. The path was narrow, and we walked, pressing closely together. Only the sound of our footsteps and the faint creaking of the stones broke the strange silence. "Where are we going?" whispered Sarah, much closer to me than ever. Her voice sounded fearful. "I don't know," I replied, though I didn't understand why I kept going. It was more than just curiosity. It felt like a magnetic field pulling me in. Suddenly, we reached a vast cave. It was larger than our entire group, and in the center stood a massive stone structure. It looked like an ancient altar, covered in elaborate carvings. Every line and every symbol on it seemed alive. They moved with the changing light, as though they had been taken from some other dimension. "What is this?" Mark whispered, his voice heavy with fear. I didn't answer. I felt as though I were tethered to this place. The feeling was such that the altar was asking something of us. What had we brought with us into this forest? I noticed the stone symbols began to glow even brighter, and the shadows around us started to shift, forming faces that watched us. Suddenly, I heard the voices again, quiet, but clear. "You cannot leave. You are here forever." The voice seemed to come from the depths of the cave, echoing in my head, blurring the lines of reality. We stood frozen, as if enchanted, and suddenly we heard something incomprehensible. Singing? Or maybe it was just our imagination. But it grew louder and sharper. It felt as though the entire forest, the whole cave, was alive, watching us, and had already made its decision. We began to lose our sense of time. And suddenly, it became so hard to breathe that I noticed how my lungs struggled to draw in air. Everything I saw was shrouded in fog. My vision started to blur, and with it, reality began to dissolve. The feeling that someone was watching us returned. "We need to get out of here," Mark shouted. His face was pale, and his eyes filled with terror. We turned toward the exit, but the tunnel we had entered suddenly changed. It grew longer and darker. Every step we took seemed to increase the distance, and the forest was swallowing us more and more. Something worse began to hang in the air. I couldn't sense any smells, feel warmth or cold. It was as if I had become part of this endless darkness. The open cave had become cramped. We tried to make our way back, but the paths seemed to twist around us. It felt as though we were walking in circles, and even the air was pressing down on us, holding us in this place. The shadows around us moved, changing shape, creating strange, eerie images. "There's no way out," Sarah whispered, bowing her head. Her voice was muffled by fear. We tried to push through to the other side of the cave, but suddenly we all started to squeeze together. The forest was so close now that I felt its cold breath, squeezing our hearts. I couldn't tell where we were, but one thing was clear, we could no longer move. "What's happening to us?" Mark asked. His voice sounded muffled, as if he were no longer himself. I didn't know how to answer. It was more than just fear. It was like the realization that we had become part of this terrifying place. Time and space seemed to cease to exist. We were nothing more than figures being watched by a dreadful force. We stood still, gazing at the endless darkness around us. The forest had become heavy, like a deadly embrace pulling us into its depths. Every movement, every glance seemed to be drawn in by this invisible yet powerful field. The winds had changed, becoming hot and dense. The air grew heavy, and we couldn't even think, as if our consciousness was being squeezed by something dark and powerful. Fear enveloped me, yet at the same time, I felt some incomprehensible pull that made me keep going. We were all silent, frozen from what we had experienced. We no longer understood where reality ended and this dark entity began. I looked at my friends, but their faces, though familiar, seemed different. There was emptiness in their eyes. Their gaze was no longer alive. "We have to get out," whispered Sophia, her voice weak, but with an unwavering determination. We began moving backward, but the more we walked, the more it seemed the forest didn't want to release us. The shadows stretched behind us, and the sky was covered with dark clouds that blocked any possible glimmer of light. It was as if the black shore was consuming everything alive around us. Each step we took felt like an attempt to break free from invisible arms. But every time we moved forward, the forest seemed to pull us back. It changed shape, as if it itself were alive. The trees became different, their bark was hollow, and from their branches dripped black liquid that looked like slime. After hours of wandering, we finally saw light. But it wasn't just light, it was some yellow, distorted glow emanating from the depths of the forest. We started moving toward this light, and with every step, it seemed to get brighter, but its warmth became unpleasant. It was like a call, like an enticement. "What is that?" asked Chuck quietly, clutching his water bottle, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "I don't know," I replied, but deep down I felt that this place was not as it seemed. As we approached, I felt my legs grow heavier. It was as if they had become part of the earth, bound to this place, to this cursed shore. The trees that had once seemed enormous now resembled statues, desecrated by ancient power. The shadows began to stir around us again, but now they weren't just shadows. They were faces, deformed, malicious, and gleaming in the dark. Finally, we emerged into an open clearing, and I felt my heart tighten with fear. Before us lay the same beach, the black shore. But now it looked even more terrifying. The sand wasn't just black, it appeared as molten metal particles, burning with blue flames. The water in the sea had become completely black, and its surface moved strangely, as if it had its own will. But the worst part, I suddenly realized that we couldn't find our way back. The place began to change around us again. All these hours, we had been nothing more than puppets, playing by the rules of this strange game. "We can't go back," Sophia said, gripping my shoulder. Her hands were cold, and her face was tense. "No, we'll get out," I answered forcefully, though I didn't believe my words. Then I heard a rustling, followed by a loud screech. From the water rose a massive dark mass, something between a sea monster and an ancient mechanism. It was moving toward us, parting the dark water, leaving a black trail behind. "What is that?" Chuck hissed, his voice trembling with fear. It wasn't just a monster. It was part of this place. Its eyes were as dark as night, filled with an unspeakable evil. But the scariest part, it knew who we were and why we were here. I realized that we hadn't just gotten lost. The forest hadn't simply captured us. We had become part of its soul, its dreadful being. And now it had brought us back here for a reason. We were its victims, and our story was now destined to become part of its dark legend. We began to retreat, but every step only heightened the terror. With each step on this black sand, I felt it swallowing us, becoming heavier. I saw how others tried to escape, but they couldn't. "Don't run," I said, and the voice echoed in my head, as if it were no longer mine. It was more than just sounds. It was part of this terrifying, living place. My body trembled with fear, but suddenly I realized there was no more choice. We wouldn't return. This place had become part of us, and we had become part of it. When the dark mass reached us, I felt it consume every thought, every cell of my body, and we all became part of this black shore, this endless darkness. We found ourselves in oblivion, in the darkness that enveloped us. The black shore had now become our home, our trap. Nothing indicated that we had ever been here, and this place seemed to erase our memories, forcing us to forget who we were before this moment. We saw neither the sky nor the stars, only an endless black horizon that swallowed everything around us. But the terror that gripped us did not relent. It was more than just fear, it was an unpredictable anxiety, deepening with every movement. The forest once again transformed, its trees growing denser, their branches bending as if following an unknown impulse. The place breathed with us. "This can't be real," Sophia whispered, her face now resembling a mask, no longer reflecting the spirit of life. I looked at her but couldn't respond. My own thoughts seemed to blur. Something in the air made us forget. Forget everything that had happened up until now. I felt my memories beginning to melt away, while new horrors filled my mind. "We have to get out of here," Chuck said, his voice barely audible as the entire forest seemed to compress around us. His eyes were wounded, and even his usual confidence had vanished. I turned my head, and again I saw the horrific creature. The shadow, towering before us, grew even larger, its outline merging with that of the forest. The black body moved like a dark current, consuming everything in its path. Its eyes, like two bottomless pits, spoke of something beyond a mere monster. It was the very essence of this place. "We can't escape," I said coldly, though inside I felt fear. We weren't just disappearing. We were becoming part of this dark world, this endless sea of shadows and pain. I couldn't understand why I felt it so deeply. This wasn't just fear. It was as if something inside me, something ancient and dark, began to spread through my consciousness. Time and space no longer existed. Everything around us became part of a vast, dark matrix. And we were part of it. "What do we do?" Fran asked, her voice choked with a sense of hopelessness. Her eyes glimmered in the darkness, but the light didn't warm anything. I didn't know the answer. But what was happening around us left no room for doubt. This wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, consuming us, turning us into its prey. And now that we were here, there was no way back. This was a trap, and we had fallen into it. We were becoming part of its dark power. The longer we stood, the more I felt that we were no longer just visitors to this place. We were part of its painful reality. The black shore was no longer just a beach. It was a merciless, deadly trap, pulling in everyone who tried to enter its domain. I felt it devouring our thoughts, turning us into its particles. I looked at Sophia, and suddenly our eyes met. She was her, but also not. There was no longer that light in her face that I remembered. She had become part of this place, just like me. Her skin had become hard, like stone, and her movements were no longer what they once were. "What's happening to you?" I whispered. She didn't answer. Her eyes remained empty. It seemed her soul had already been taken by this place, and she couldn't find a way out. This place didn't just take physical bodies. It took people down to their core. They became part of it. A sound, like the rustling of branches, suddenly echoed. And before us, that same dark mass appeared again. It was so large that it covered the entire horizon. In its faces, which looked like shattered stones, one could see millions of different images. These were the faces of those who had once been here and never returned. Now we had become part of their faces. The black shore had consumed us. "No!" I screamed. But there was no time left. The shadow, like a veil, enveloped us, and we no longer existed in the way we had been before. Our bodies turned to stone. Our souls became part of this endless darkness. The black shore had claimed its next victim, and we had become part of it. We were no longer alive. Every time I tried to remember who we were, the sensation became more and more blurred. Our thoughts were incomplete, fragmented, and it seemed as if we had become part of this dark entity that was absorbing us. Strangely, Even fear began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming sense of emptiness. We were no longer human. We were not even spirits. We had become something more incomprehensible, part of this deadly, bottomless space. The dark shadow that once seemed like a mere monster was now something greater. It was everything. It was the place, the time, the death. It was the Black Shore. And we, like those who had come before us, had become part of it. Some of us couldn't bear it, and their souls turned into formless horrors, wandering in the darkness, trying to find a way back, though they no longer existed. But then, in that endless darkness, we felt something new, a sound. At first, it was weak, barely audible, like a breath in the grave silence. But with every second, it grew louder, coming closer to us, piercing the endless gloom. I heard a voice, quiet but sharp and clear. "You are not ready yet. Not all of you have become mine." And then I understood. This was not just a trap. This was a choice. Perhaps we had been chosen. The Black Shore takes everything, takes life, but it also leaves part of the people for itself, those who can become part of its dark, otherworldly essence. We heard voices, we heard the screams of people who had once come here and never returned. They had become like us, a little more, a little less. They too had become darkness. And now we had become part of them, destroyed, but not entirely. We probably thought we could escape. At first, when we still had the strength, we tried to get away. We walked through what had once been a forest, but this forest was no longer a forest. It was a living entity, controlling every movement of ours, making us wander until we lost all hope. Time and space no longer made sense. We walked, but every step took us further from what we sought and closer to what we could not see. There was no place for salvation anymore. The Black Shore did not allow us to leave. It had bound us, and now we were its shadows. There was no laughter, no conversation. Everything had become mute. Only the darkness consumed us more and more. Our steps became as empty as our thoughts, lifeless and hollow. We could no longer tell if we were alive or if we had already become those whom this merciless, otherworldly world had consumed. We had become part of the Black Shore. Did anything human remain within us? Was there even a small part of who we had been before we stepped onto this place? That question made no sense. And perhaps it never did. We had become immortal fragments of this infinite darkness. Now, we were part of the Black Shore, and perhaps, we would never again escape its embrace. And when the next travelers, like us, come in search of these lands, they might see us among the dark shadows, to prevent them from repeating our mistake. But even they will not know we were here. The Black Shore consumes everything. Thus ends our story. The story of how we became part of something terrifying and endless. A story that will be forgotten, and at the same time, a story that will live on until the darkness of the Black Shore destroys everything that can be destroyed. This is our end, but also the beginning of a new cycle. We, and all who come after us, will remain shadows in the darkness of the Black Shore, forever consumed by the same forces that once brought us here.